Yeah.
We're here. We're live. Can everyone see us? I'm so sorry for the technical difficulties. Give us a wave in the comments if this is working, folks. And I'm going to assume that it is, because this is what it should be looking like. Hi, and welcome, and thanks for sticking around. My name is Beth Spotswood. I am Alta's digital editor. I want to thank you all for joining us for episode 24 of Alta Asks Live. Today, I'm excited to welcome William Deverell, historian, Alta contributor, and director of the Huntington-USC Institute of California and the West. Yes, oh, look, we're getting all of these yeses. Okay, thanks, guys. Thank you. Fabulous. Bill is here today to talk about ways in which the West has tackled health crises before, in the hopes that if history is bound to repeat itself, we will emerge from the other side of the current pandemic as we have so many times before. Bill, along with graduate student Daniel Wallace, collected and analyzed a number of pandemic-related artifacts from California's past, which we published in Alta. You can click directly below to see those images, and I encourage you to. While you're listening, it'll be fun to look through those. Bill and I will chat for about 25 minutes. We're late today, so we can go a little long if that's cool with everyone. And then we're going to tackle your questions and comments. So please feel free to dive in on the chat feature here, or there's also an ask a question button below. A little bookkeeping before we get underway. If you're not already a member of Alta, now is the perfect time to subscribe. We are a quarterly magazine focused on Alta and the West. Maybe you've heard about the 3 Los Angeles Press Club Awards we recently won. At the end of this month, we will release our fall 2020 issue, a noir-themed stunner of a magazine, if I do say so myself. We aim to expand on the work we do in the magazine with events like this, and we are thrilled that you are tuning in today. You can follow Alta Journal on Crowdcast to stay up to date on events like this one. If the skies are in an indication, or the first 5 minutes of this, things are a bit wonky in the world right now. Should we encounter any more tech issues, I encourage you to stay with us and we will figure them out. With that, let's dig in. Bill Deverell, one of my favorite people to work with, where are you right now?
Oh, thanks so much, Beth. I apologize to everybody assembled here. I think the tech issues were at my end in northern Wyoming, where I've gone with my son on an annual road trip to the Grand Tetons. So we're here for another couple of days before we turn around and come back, dodging obviously horrific and apocalyptic fires all the way back.
Have you heard about the California skies today? Because it's bonkers.
Absolutely, and I can see it in the chat as well. And I'm checking in on the fires that are close to home in Southern California, and it's just awful.
All right, your sound is a little fuzzy, but we're just going to go with it. If you tweak a little, great. But we're going to fly. So I wanted to kind of start in chronological order. You're a historian. Can you think of what are the earliest documented pandemics and plagues of the West? Did they all come with the colonization of the region? Or do you know if there were health crises that hit the indigenous communities here before us?
Oh, certainly there's going to be health crises that hit indigenous communities prior to contact and colonization and conquest. Although I think it's fair to say they accelerate with the introduction of European pathogens, which we mark really for the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries here in the far West. But, finding disease pathogens working through human populations, they leave all kinds of markers in the archaeological and paleontological records. So it's a long history, but I would say it certainly has accelerated in the last several centuries.
And so in your piece, the pandemic survival manuals, that again, there's this green button right below. You guys can check it out. Oh, Bill, we're asking, can you speak a little louder or turn your volume up, Bill, when you talk?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
So in the survival manual piece, you start with cholera in the 1880s. Let's just kind of the really basics. What was that health crisis like, and how was it eventually overcome?
Well, cholera is a real killer, of course. Cholera is terribly infectious and just wreaks havoc on the internal organs of the body. And we'd seen cholera out here in California, or at least in the California setting, roughly from the late 1830s forward. but cholera could decimate European cities, could decimate East Coast cities. It travels largely through very poor hygiene systems of water and sewage distribution. And so in the post-Civil War period, cholera comes to California, and people are terrified of it for good reason. Its mortality rate is very, very high. It's an invisible pathogen. And there's a fair amount of what we often see with these kinds of insults. We often see people taking the very low road, which is to ignore it and assume that somehow they'll escape the worst of it, which is really the absolute wrong thing to do.
Okay, that's kind of topical for today, if we've been following the news at all. All right, so we move on, at least as I'm going chronologically through this piece, into the bubonic plague. That's around 1900. Then there was a second bubonic plague in 1907, and then the influenza of 1918 to around 1920, I think. What was up with the back-to-back health crises?
That's a really good question, Beth. You can look at the arrival of bubonic and then eventually pneumonic plague in the first several decades of the 20th century in Northern California first, then Southern California in the 1920s. Sandwiched in between there is the H1N1 Spanish influenza of 1918, 1920. A lot of it just comes bang, bang, bang. And of course, the Spanish influenza epidemic is a real killer, kills 50 million people worldwide. A lot of it probably has to do with the crowding of the cities. The cities are becoming great magnets for industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. So they're suffering under real crowded conditions. So a lot of the distribution of contagion is going to be due to that. And then on top of that, what I'd already mentioned with, say, cholera, is very poor water quality and water distribution.
When we had spoken earlier, you mentioned the importance of water in all of this, especially these early pandemics. And, part of me is wondering, is it just kind of as we've gotten more sophisticated about the way we treat illness, about the way we manage things like water and the municipal cleanliness? Folks, if you are frozen, press refresh and play. I'm seeing that in the comments. We had talked a little bit about kind of the way that people had to change their behaviors to survive each one of these. With the Spanish influenza, or the influenza of 1818, and I'll get to the kind of racial and xenophobic question in a second, masks became a really big issue. Were people more willing to wear masks then than they are today, or was there the anti-masker contingent?
There is an anti-mask, I don't know if I'd call it a movement. There's an anti-mask eruption across the West in the 1918 epidemic. However, there are regulations and rules and then social pressures that are put on people to wear masks, and they do. Municipal authorities can fine individuals for not wearing masks. Municipal employees like police departments, etc., they wear masks. I've even found an image of a parlor photograph of a family where mom and dad and their children all have the masks on, and so does the family cat. Now, we could look at that and think that they're being maybe whimsical, maybe they're making fun of the mask ordinance, or we can look at it the other way, which is, in essence, everybody's taking part. Everybody's recognizing this is a simple mechanism that you can flatten the curve. And so we certainly have a pretty wide following of mask wearing in the 19-teens.
Was it politicized at all?
It is politicized, again, for somewhat similar reasons that you see today, which is the state is intervening into our personal choices, et cetera. So you do see some of that. There are protests against masks, but I think the death rate is so rapid and steep that I think cooler heads prevail and mask wearing becomes much more of a convention than perhaps the anti-mask people had imagined it would be.
How quickly, as we look through these artifacts that you've found, they're survival manuals that appear to be produced by like the government, the city. How quickly did they acknowledge the seriousness of whatever health crisis happened to be going on with, if it was the flu, and kind of turn that around? Especially, you can't just do some clip art on a computer and crank this out. I mean, it was an undertaking to communicate information to people really quickly.
Yeah, it's a great question, Beth. I think it depends on the place. So some municipalities act slower than others. But this is also a time, let's look at California, for instance. This is a time when public health is becoming increasingly better funded through the progressive era by public monies. The expertise of public health is rising very steeply with very, very sophisticated medical practice and medical awareness. And these pamphlets, which are in essence what my grad student and I called the social media of the day, they're mass produced, they're ways to behave, how not to congregate in tight places, how not to lure the contagion into your own body. They're mass distributed, they're put together very quickly. You've got cheap printing by then, you've got cheap photographic reproduction, and the public health officials know they have a crisis on their hands.
Who was in charge of figuring out the procedures for the pamphlets?
So again, I think that varies. Oftentimes when politicians on either this side or that side of an election or other political gamesmanship, when they get involved, their decisions are not always the best in terms of a public health perspective. But public health officials, county health officials, city health officials, university and county hospital officials, they know what they're doing. So in the plague outbreak of 1924, some of the most heroic measures are done by largely anonymous, as we might expect, largely anonymous frontline medical workers, men and women alike, who recognize that quarantine is a sufficient or at least a really good practice, and they don't demonize the sick.
All right. Well, speaking of demonization, you know, as we've unfortunately seen with the COVID-19 virus, certain ethnicities are being targeted or blamed unjustly for this pandemic. That's something that you actually wrote a separate piece for Alta Online about California's really problematic history with targeting, in your piece specifically, Asians and Mexicans, kind of the blaming them for the illnesses. How is that? I mean, it's
tragically tried and true. I mean, the ways in which the society draws lines around and across ethnicity and race are already manifest in any given situation in Western American history. And so if you add to that the fear and the stoked fear of pandemic disease, those lines are going to become sharper and harder on the part of many people. And so it's a tragic reflex in California and other parts of the West and other parts of the world's history to reach out. And oftentimes what they'll do is they'll associate pandemic disease or contagious disease with ethnicity or race, when in fact, oftentimes the vector is pandemic disease and poverty.
Right. And
so they leap over that, and we get some of the most ugly reactions and responses. But at the same time, I mean, I would like to suggest there are largely anonymous, though not completely, heroic actions in the midst of any one of these examples, including today, of course. And so more attention on the anonymous or otherwise heroism of making sure we get through all this, that's something we could also concentrate on alongside what is really dastardly.
Can you name any of those non-anonymous heroes of some of our past pandemics?
Sure. So I have one. There's a public health official in Los Angeles in the 1920s, a crusading young doctor, child of immigrants from Russia. His name is Emil Bogen. He eventually makes his mark in both research and administrative work caring for tuberculosis victims. Because, you know, tuberculosis is a scourge up until just after the Second World War and streptomycin and antibiotic treatments. But Dr. Bogen is on the front lines, also raised a daughter of very prominent public health work herself. But he's on the front lines of dealing with the poor Mexican communities near the Los Angeles River, where the plague burns through in basically Halloween time of 1924. And he understands that it's a plague bacillus. It has nothing to do with race or ethnicity. It has to do with poverty, rats, and fleas. And he's heroic, and he saves a lot of lives.
What was his name again?
His first name is Emil, E-M-I-L. His last name is Bogen, B-O-G-E-N. And the more I learn about him, the more impressed I am. He's no longer around. He died in the 1960s. He ended his career being very prominent at the Olive View Tuberculosis Sanitarium, the largest TB sanitarium west of the Mississippi in the North San Fernando Valley.
All right, wow. Okay, Bill, I'm going to ask you to sit 6 inches back from your computer. I feel like that's going to help the speaker. Okay. Thank you. I'm making this text.
Coming at you, Beth. Coming at you.
It didn't really work. In the mid 20th century, we see diseases like measles and polio, and you and I have talked about that a little. Those don't necessarily count as pandemics or plagues, but much like health crises before them, behavior was required to change. I like to think that California and the West is at the forefront of kind of progressive policies around all sorts of issues. Can you tell us that we were better at taking on restorative measures than everyone else? Could that be true?
I don't know how you'd come up with the metrics exactly to weigh California against other places. And California has a checkered record, in my view, about approaches to vaccinations, even unto today. However, certainly the medical establishments up and down the coast, the research facilities ranging from Stanford, UCSF, on down to USC, Caltech, UCLA, the county hospitals and their major research wings, they're putting a lot of time and energy into addressing these contagions that can lead to pandemics.
Are your archives being tapped by more than previously by researchers who are looking to kind of explore our past around pandemics and health crises?
Well, fascinating. The archives are generally closed, so the interest is there, but access right now in COVID-19 times is restricted or even cut off. However, I do believe we will have a great rise in the research driven by this recent pandemic. The sociological, medical, and historical and cultural data that we as a society, let's just say California, is gathering in terms of the response to COVID-19 is going to keep academics across fields busy for an entire generation. We recently accessioned the Olive View Tuberculosis Sanitarium records at USC. Those are going to be a treasure trove for the dealing with a very, very difficult disease, which now we've largely beaten, although there is drug-resistant TB, but we've largely beaten it by way of antibiotic interventions. But people are going to go look at those records and start to piece together the commonalities and continuities across various pandemic moments. You bet.
What is kind of the Huntington-USC's Institute of the West job in gathering kind of COVID-19 archives? Are you doing any work around that?
So great question again. The University of Southern California libraries are gathering COVID-19 response documents, images, and other things. So, and they're not alone. Many special collections and an archive across the state, medical and otherwise, have realized that this moment of pandemic is going to produce all kinds of responses, written, pictorial, photographic, and gathering those is a really, really important historical exercise for those who come after us.
Oh, okay. We're getting questions here. So we're going to chat for about 5 more minutes. And then I want to encourage you guys to, all of our viewers to ask questions. You can ask them in the Ask a Question button right below us or over in the chat. I will try and check all of them out if I can. Where does the AIDS epidemic fit in with the West's health history, Bill?
The AIDS epidemic is one in which I think California, out of tragic circumstances nonetheless, California can be proud of the response that it met the AIDS crisis with. Slow, but not as slow as other parts of the country, for goodness sakes. And the research going on about the AIDS epidemic and HIV was profoundly important in California. At the same time, social activism, ACT UP, other groups demanding attention be paid to this scourge, very prominent in California and very successful over the long term. The response was, I think, across the country, far slower than it should have been, of course. But California should be pleased by the ways in which it met the tragedy head on. But of course, part of that is motivated simply by the catastrophic numbers that we saw in California beginning in the 1980s.
Now, forgive me for forgetting the details on this, but wasn't there a big, during the influenza of 1918, 1919, a big to-do at the Cow Palace in San Francisco over masks?
I'm not aware of it, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, the notion that everybody in 1918, 19, the relationship people had to people who were sick and died is far more profound than even our big COVID-19 numbers, because it's so prevalent. But the notion that everybody followed the rules and wore masks, it's not true. So if there was a big to-do, it wouldn't surprise me.
Bob Wolf is asking, can you explain how the 18 to 1920 influenza epidemic, and just really quickly, is that the appropriate Spanish flu is?
Well, the irony is that it's called the Spanish flu. I mean, I would stay away from it as well because of the associations with what we hear today. But
right.
the irony is it's called the Spanish flu because the Spanish government actually publicized the reality of it, where other European governments put it under the rug. So it's not that the notion was that it began in Spain, which is the kind of racist language we hear today. But, H1N1, the great influenza pandemic of the 1918 period, there are other names to call it.
Okay, well, the H1N1 of the 1918 to 1920, how did it end, and what lessons can we learn from that, the way it ended for today?
What a great question. It ended because people finally realized it was here, and it was here in a big way. And so social distancing, a lot of social tracking in the ways in which we do now with COVID-19, trying to keep an eye on human associations and the possibility of contagious transfer of disease, and mask wearing for sure, and quarantine and isolation in either hospital wards or literally homes and neighborhoods. So it ended in a fairly, I don't know if I'd say crude way, but it ended by pretty obvious measures of trying to inhibit the transfer and flatten the curve. And people thought that the early surge would go away, which it largely did across the summer, and then it roared back. And so there are lessons in that. These agents, these pathogens and these viral agents, they are out to save themselves, and they will evolve and manipulate and try to stay 1 or 2 or 3 steps ahead of anything that's thrown at them.
It's like that line from Jurassic Park, nature finds a way, or life finds a way. That's interesting. So just to kind of like end Bob's question, what can we take away from, that the from that lesson to today, that the social distancing work, that these really basic, obvious masks, stay 6 feet apart, do the uncomfortable work of staying away from your friends for a while?
Yeah, I think all those are important. I think there's an underlying truth as well, which is, though it was not perfect, community cohesion in the 19-teens across region or across state boundaries or whatever, the notion that this was something to be tackled by the public, with perhaps not the divisiveness that we see today, undoubtedly that helped. Undoubtedly that helped. And, the 19-teens and early 1920s are not a perfect time in American history by any means. But I think the underlying social cohesiveness in the midst of this pandemic disease was useful in eventually getting past it.
We've got 2 kind of questions and comments that both relate to government influence in this. One is that, in these survival manuals that you and Daniel presented to Alta readers, they were mostly done by the government, and that people trusted the government much more back then. There was a kind of a perhaps blind trust of the government. Pamela asks, in past pandemics, were the presidents of the United States supportive of the public health experts? How involved on a national level was the president?
A very good question. The Wilson administration doesn't address the influenza pandemic very much. I think it devolves more to state and local and county health and political officials. Trust in the government is a slippery concept. This is also a 19-teens government, which is repressing radical dissent, putting people in jail for radical dissent, deporting people for radical dissent. And so it's a society that has its own fractures and fissures. And I think any given official, state, local, federal, or otherwise, may have a different opinion about how to address the pandemic than others. And the Wilson administration's lack of direct response to the pandemic probably meant that it would last longer.
As a historical expert, this is a question from me, Bill, you're a historical expert. Which pandemic or plague, health crisis of our past does the current one most resemble?
Oh, what a cool question. Well, the numbers are vastly different, but COVID-19 has struck fear and health crisis into the lives of Americans, much like 1918, 1919. And it is a global pandemic, much like 1918, 1919. And so that kind of respiratory pulmonary contagion of water vapor, breathing, coughing, and spitting on one another, that's similar in terms of disease transmission, I would say. So America likes to think in century-long leaps. So the fact that it was about a century ago, or just over that, that creates some kind of continuity in the eyes and ears of Americans.
Can we wait another 100 years before this happens again?
No, as you pointed out, with plague, cholera at the end of the 19th century, a couple of the eruptions of this plague, influenza, we may not expect them to come chock-a-block back to back like that. But pandemic disease, we're not going to eradicate pandemic disease.
All right. We're supposed to be hopeful.
Well, we can see the best and worst of humanity in times of pandemic disease, and this instance is no different than those in the past.
Catherine Gavsey asks, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Catherine. Thank you for joining us. What do we know about the impact of the 1918 pandemic on the Black community and other minorities?
That is a really good question that I am not expert on. I suspect there are monographs that have been written about this. I suspect the association with crowded urban conditions and the Black outmigration from the South into the Rust Belt and then eventually into the American West with crowded urban conditions probably increases, maybe even exponentially, the rise of contagious transfer of influenza. So my hunch is that it has a more deleterious effect on the African American or underrepresented communities. So, much like we've seen now with COVID-19, its impact is going to be not distributed evenly across socioeconomic groups by any stretch of the imagination. And we also see in California history with some of these other pandemics, I'm not sure about H1N1, some of the other pandemics, white Californians will say publicly, this is not a disease that will affect us. And they're wrong. They're totally wrong.
Cynthia's pointing out in the comments here that Philly's Mutter Museum goes into the issue of Black people during the 1918 pandemics. And apparently, which is one of my favorite museums in the world. I went to college in Philadelphia, and that's amazing. That many Black people who died wound up as medical cadavers. Wow.
No surprise. Yeah.
So we've got time. If anyone wants to, if I've missed a question in the comments or down below, you've got a couple more minutes. I'm going to ask my final question for Bill, and I will try and grab any last ones. Well, as a historian, you seem to have to quickly be an expert at kind of a medical history. I know you're working on a huge wildfire project about the West. I know very excitingly that you are a historical consultant on an HBO show, Perry Mason, which everyone at Alta is watching enthusiastically to see your name in the credits, and it's because it's awesome. You know, you're not a medical doctor. Has it been a challenge for you to get really educated about this, and have you had to do so because of kind of recent events, or has this always been part of being a historian, is being learning about the history of medical crises, of wildfires, of whatever's affecting the region that you focus on?
So I guess I guess, Beth, it's both. I would be misrepresenting my knowledge if I said I was an expert on epidemic disease or an expert on wildfire. But they are both critical issues that our society is wrestling with and has wrestled with. So there's a historical trail and arc to that. And I can, to the best of my ability, trace that arc as an historian. And then inevitably, people like myself have to turn to true experts, physicians, public health experts, firefighters, to learn what amounts to the on-the-ground realities. But the fact that these are current crises that have this tail, that's where the historians can come in and say, here's how it looks the same, here's how it looks different, here's perhaps where we might learn something better, or how we address this better in the future. That's the job of an historian.
And just to loop back to something that you said previously, the way that this one is different, and I feel like it's a negative one, but it's that it's more divisive now. Is that correct?
Yeah, I missed the last part of that, Beth. You broke up.
The way that it's more divisive now, that we are more divided as a public.
Well, in a sense, it's too soon to tell. We are in divisive times. That's demonstrable to me. America is always divisive. And the 1918, 1919, 1920 period, it's a rough period for a lot of reasons. I do think the social cohesion in that period compared to today is probably more, but I think time will tell that story.
Your historians are in it for the long game. That's right. All right, so we have time for one more question. Amanda Greenberger asks, do we see hints/ghosts of the 1918-1990 experience in the 20s and 30s in the next 2 decades? I would imagine it was a life-defining experience as World War I or World War II were.
That's a great question from my friend Amanda. What stuns me is how a young adult coming of age, perhaps in the influenza era, is then faced with World War I, is faced with influenza, is faced with the Roaring '20s, which are filled with all kinds of excess and trouble, and then the Depression, and then the Second World War. So these are very difficult challenges. They forge people, and there is a sense of cohesion that we can get through this together, probably best expressed during America's involvement in the Second World War of those cases. But people do reflect in the 20s. You do get people saying, I lived through that First World War. I lived through the flu epidemic. It's my time to really live. So some of those excesses are probably tied to the sacrifices made 1918, 1919, 1920.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, with that, we're going to wrap it up. First of all, thank you to everyone for sticking with us through our relatively, compared to what we've been talking about, minor, slight technical issues. If you were late to the party, a couple of people have asked in the comments. We will have this entire conversation up on our website a little later today. I'll do it immediately after this. Don't forget to book your spot for next week. We will be back here at 12:30 on Wednesday, September 16th with LitHub executive editor and Alta contributor, John Freeman. He's going to chat with Alta's editor-at-large, Mary Melton, about his wildly popular look at the new California canon and sneak peek our upcoming California book club. So you're not going to want to miss that. Again, it's Wednesday, September 16th at 12:30. A big, big thank you to Bill Deverell and everyone at the Huntington for promoting this on our behalf. There's still over 100 people here. It's so exciting. So thank you again to Bill and to the amazing group of people who joined us today. I bid you adieu and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth.